When dawn came, so did the guards, but with differences. Gone were the black and white Iron Cross ribbons, decorations for bravery won by every man in their army, it seemed. These they had replaced with bright red decorations, and regimental buttons worn on their caps had given way to red ones. The guards gave us the usual piece of bread and litre of acorn juice. Then we awaited events. Lorries hurried past, each displaying a large red flag and filled with shouting troops. They all went one way, eastwards. There is an armistice. That evoked a cheer from those of us who heard the thrilling bit of news. Wally, George and I found ourselves in a state of intense, excited joy, though unable to tell each other of the relief from the worry, doubt and general misery, which, since becoming prisoners, had defeated most of our efforts to remain normally hopeful. Although Wally had managed to smile sometimes, I felt sure that in happier times he would have been just the cheery chap everyone loved to have around. I certainly had benefited from my association with that young man, whose fair dealing and lack of guile put new life into my ability to trust my fellow, which had faded because of the deplorable overall standard of behaviour and of honour among those with whom I had dwelt recently. The discomforts, food shortages, and absence of any of life's pleasures had so quickly reduced them to the level of wild animals with all their snarling and violent grabbing of anything edible. Not so Wally. His word, given to me and to George, really was his bond, and he expected and got the same from me. So passed Armistice Day, 1918. Next morning, Haybag, of all people, strode into the hall and ordered us to come outside. Wally, George and I complied quickly. We rolled our blankets and slung them over our shoulders. Haybag gave the order to march, indicating a westerly direction. We set off willingly, an unusually high-spirited platoon of skin-and-bone shufflers. After half an hour, some distance ahead, a huge black cloud of smoke appeared. As we drew nearer, we started to hear explosions, big and small, and soon we saw that a large ammunition store was on fire. Some bullets, but mostly shells, blowing up at random. Looking ahead with some concern, we reckoned that, if we followed the road, we should not have to pass the conflagration at close range. But when we reached the nearest point on the road, Haybag ordered us along a path which cut off the bend in the road and took us very close to the dump and put us in much greater danger, of course. To prove he meant it, he drew back his rifle bolt, rammed a bullet into the chamber, and took aim at us. So, as Haybag went round the bend, literally, we took the pathway and felt the heat of that fire. For some minutes, flying shrapnel and such made the scene very similar to a battlefield, and we all felt some temptation to break into a gallop. But we simply couldn't, so we proceeded at our usual crawl, just hoping we'd be lucky. Which we were. No casualties, and we duly rejoined Haybag on the road, feeling we were better men than him. I hoped he didn't realize we hadn't run because of physical weakness rather than bravery, and that he felt suitably ashamed of his dirty trick. He must have hoped that some or all of us would be blown up, leaving him free to go home, if such a miserable devil had a home. Later, when we passed a farm, many of us dived into a heap of swedes left by the roadside. We'd not eaten much that day, and here was food indeed. But Haybag raised his rifle and this time pulled the trigger. The bullet went just over our heads, and, as he reloaded, he told us to put down the Swedes. Probably the farmer was French and intended us to help ourselves, other freed prisoners having passed that way, no doubt. But our relentless Prussian reckoned to play his miserable role to the bitter end. Now, more groups of German troops passed by, heading east. They carried things obviously pillaged, such as chickens, ducks, sacks full of food. Occasionally they drove one or more cows, or a goat, or led a horse. The road became thick with men, all going the opposite way to us. Then, a column of lorries, each with its large red flag and load of red-decorated men, hurried by as if trying to put as great a distance as possible between themselves and the Allied army. We felt tired and hungry, and Haybag surprised us by allowing a rest stop. Those fortunate who had picked up anything edible ate it. Wally, George and I chewed some cabbage, drank some water, and talked about what might be our eventual fate amid this rabble of retreating enemy troops now bent on wholesale looting. One man near us opened a can of some blackened foodstuff. I'm not sure what, but I noticed before he did it that the top was swollen. We discussed that, but he ate some of the contents regardless. Looking around for Haybag to give his usual harsh command, I was amazed to see him walking off eastwards with several of his compatriots, and at last displaying no further interest in us. We're free. We can do as we please. Come on, boys, let's go and get back to our people. At once, we fell into a far brisker rate of progress, in spite of the tide of Germans flowing towards us. However, because of hunger, weakness, and general ill health, this more strenuous pace made me feel light in the head. I responded to the odd remark from Wally, but felt increasingly detached from everything and everybody around me. Worse, with great alarm, I suddenly realized I had left my rolled blanket at our stopping place. I must have turned around and, without a word to anybody, tottered back along the road. I recognized the place. All right, for lying in the middle of the road was the man who had eaten that black stuff out of the can. His face had a bluish look, and he did not appear to be alive. I searched for my blanket and found it, then felt the chap's wrist for any sign of life before resuming the hopeful homeward journey. On my own now. I came to a village, empty, it seemed, apart from a few retreating Germans. I sat down for a while. Soon no more Germans either. I felt like the last man left on earth. I did not enter any of the deserted houses. Their owners would return one day, and I did not wish to loot, supposing the Germans had left anything worth taking. In our army, it was forbidden to move even a brick from a wrecked building, all being the property of our French allies. Slowly, onwards. Over the next several hours, I saw only 2 Germans driving a cow before them. By a farmyard, well stood a bucket on a rope. Someone had left it full of water, so I drank from it and refilled my mess can. I found a turnip and a potato among the surrounding farmyard muck, washed them in the bucket, and ate them. The door of a nearby shed stood open. I went inside, laid down, wrapped my blanket around my body, and slept. When I awoke, it was dark. I lay there, dozing occasionally, till daylight. In the next village, not a soul did I see, and when a door banged, I jumped from fright. Tottering onwards, resting, losing track of time, I eventually entered a town of sorts, and there I had a strange life-saving experience. Moving along a deserted street, I heard hurrying footsteps behind me, turned, and saw a woman in nurse's uniform. Not the usual hospital outfit, but everything white and a small red cross on the headdress. She took me to a house not far away. There another nurse awaited us. The first nurse had spoken to me in French, but reverted to English after I had, in my limited French, asked if she could speak my language. My faded, ragged uniform had no doubt puzzled her, as it didn't belong to any known army. They gave me some sort of milky soup and several square, thick white biscuits with soft cheese. Later, I realized how careful and wise they had been to give me only light food. When I had eaten, they led me to an upstairs room where they left me with a pail of warm water, a piece of yellow soap, a piece of white cloth, and a rough towel. For the first time in many days, I removed all my clothes and had the great pleasure of washing my face and my body, finally sitting in a chair and soaking and cleaning each foot in turn. I slept that night through on a mattress on the floor with the 2 blankets provided keeping me wonderfully warm, while a cushion under my head completed my luxurious bed. To be clean and not to lie on hard boards was beautiful comfort, and I slept till a nurse awakened me. The 2 nurses gave me coffee made almost white by a powder of milky flavour, and more of the thick white biscuits spread with the soft cheese. While I ate, we talked. I told them everything about myself, but learned little about them. Although they both had lived in France for some considerable time, they were British. How they came to this small, almost deserted town, which must have been in German hands till probably 3 days earlier, I can't say. I certainly hadn't the nerve to question those wonderful, kindly women. Those good nurses had known where best they could serve those who needed them. They would have plenty of wanderers to care for during that strange period when war organizations were grinding to a halt. They could not offer me continued shelter, so they set me off on the straight road out of the town. Once more on my own, garbed in my ragged clothes, my rolled blanket across my chest, mess can full of sweet coffee, I headed west again. In that direction, they reassured me. I would eventually meet the French army. I saw no one at all on the streets, but when the buildings petered out, in a large open space around a crossroads, I encountered a cluster of men and women. Free at last, probably short of food, the little they had possessed would have been stolen by retreating Germans. They simply waited for the French army to come to their aid. I was struck by their stillness. I could well have gone back and perhaps waited with them, for loneliness already assailed me and they were the only human beings in sight. But eventually, my view of their now tiny figures was obscured. Once more the lonely trudge. At my slow pace, I went on for what was probably several hours. In a deep sunken lane, the last German passed me. I can see him now, heading my way, an officer riding a fine horse, galloping, sabre in hand. I stood still as he drew near, a bit scared because I feared he might ride me down as a final act of revenge for his army's defeat. But he was in a happy and friendly mood. He smiled as he rode past, waved, and called out in English, "Goodbye, goodbye." I was always a poor hater, and that farewell cancelled memory of many a cruel experience caused by lesser men than that fine officer. I lay down that night in a concrete structure at a crossroads. Next morning, I resumed the trudge. Certainty, not merely hope, now sustained me, and that afternoon, a wrecked village set my pulse racing. The damage indicated I was drawing closer to the battlefield and to our French army friends. No curiosity delayed my progress through and out of the ruins, down a shell-hole-pocked hill. And there I saw the beginning of a trench system. Old battlefield memories returned, along with caution and watchfulness. A misplaced foot and all my endurance of recent trials would have been wasted. I stayed on top and moved forward very slowly, examining the ground ahead for signs of tripwires, booby traps, and small disturbed places which might suggest the presence of mines. I found a gap in the barbed wire and entered no man's land, that space between the fighters. The men of the opposing forces who bore the brunt of bloody warfare, while others thought they were important and pinned medals ad nauseam on each other's breasts, and used every ploy in the book to avoid front-line duty. And there I began to see small warning signs the Jerrys had placed, recently by the look of them, thin, wooden strips, 18 inches long, black letters on a white background, secured to the ground by metal pegs. They faced me, but would have been invisible to advancing French soldiers. These were signs, warning German troops of mine placements. As I progressed, the warnings became more numerous. I hoped that, by choosing a path halfway between them, I might avoid being blown up. Slowly and now tense almost to the point of panic, I placed one foot in front of the other. I could see a ridge of humps about 100 yards ahead, probably the forward line of the French trench system, practically no barbed wire in front of it. When several heads appeared above the humps, I knew that I had as good as made it, but they just watched and said nothing. My ragged uniform of no recognizable army may have puzzled them. I finally slid into the trench at some distance from those onlookers, and my first happy contact was with a French officer who happened to be showing a nurse round the trenches. I had stated who and what I was, and in perfect English he bade me welcome. Then together, he and the nurse led me through the trenches and back a short distance to a village where I was questioned briefly. Then a small lorry conveyed me to a place farther behind the lines. In a barn, I joined other returned prisoners, strangers to me, and was told to rest on a mattress. Soon I was given one of those long French loaves and a mug of hot, sweet cocoa. Replete and secure at last, I slept until, at some time later, I awoke, scarcely able to breathe. My belly had swollen, awful pain and discomfort assailed me. Movement did get rid of a vast accumulation of wind, but then the inevitable diarrhea took over and had to be dealt with. A tummy, too long deprived of normal nourishment, simply could not tolerate the rich sweet chocolate drink. So, both then and later, I suffered as kind people plied me generously with food, which would, of course, have been good, plain fare to fit men. I watched French colonial troops, dark of skin and in their thousands, drilling and being inspected. Probably new recruits, their uniforms and accoutrements in perfect condition. They looked fighting fit, a fine prospective army of occupation, and the fact that they were coloured men would doubly humiliate the defeated enemy. Soon we Britishers boarded a French army lorry and moved on to that fine town which we call Nancy, where they billeted us in a large barracks together with many other returned prisoners. I searched for Wally and George, but, among all these men, I knew no one at all. Everybody greeted me cheerfully, though, in good spirits, no matter what their physical condition. Still somewhat distended below, I needed no food, so I walked out of the barracks and found myself in a street mainly occupied by shops. It was then, indeed, that the wonderful feeling of freedom welled up in me, although it remained difficult to feel certain that no guard would loom up and drive me back into an enclosure. I looked into shop windows and had the pleasure of gazing at beautiful things in a jeweller's window. I came to a sweet shop, and my eyes were attracted to a bar of chocolate. I became aware of a small woman dressed in black, whom I had noticed at my side previously, looking in the same direction. She went inside, but soon emerged and smilingly handed me the bar of chocolate and another small package too. A surprised and very grateful man, I thanked her, and the sweet kindness, which prompted her to give me things for which she felt I longed, affected me almost to the point of tears. I held out my hand in offered handshake, and as I raised our joined hands, it seemed the most natural thing in the world to lean forward and kiss the back of hers. This delighted her, and therefore thrilled me, and she broke into excited talking of which I understood little. All her wartime sufferings and losses were written in lines on her dear old face, and her generosity had welled up at the sight of skinny, ragged me, whose age may have matched that of her own boy, probably long dead and buried with those thousands of our French comrades. When I raised my eyes again, I found myself being observed by a tall officer. He had stopped directly in my path in doubt as to my nationality, I soon realized, because I still wore my war prisoner rags. When I told him I was an English former POW, he took charge of me at once. He was an American airman, he told me, in charge of a depot in Nancy. "We'll go there and feed you, and you can dress up in one of our uniforms for the time being," he said. I could see that, at last, my luck was in. I set off alongside him, though matching his long strides proved difficult. What with the tummy upsets and general weakness, and now the overflowing emotions caused by 2 acts of kindness, accorded me by 2 such utterly different kinds of people. I was letting my feelings get out of control and in danger of breaking down. "Here's our place, and up the stairs we go," he said. We entered a room furnished with a table, 3 hard chairs, and not much else beyond a filing cabinet. He picked up a telephone, turned the handle, and told somebody to bring food, which he ordered in detail. Presently, a private, or rather airman, came in with a tray carrying 2 large plates of canned meat, baked beans and bread. An enormous feed, and they both adjured me to tuck it all away. Tempted to hope my stomach had settled down enough, I went at it with a will and savoured the mug of hot coffee they gave me when I had finished. The immediate effect: happy satiety and more gratitude. "Stay here while we make arrangements about your uniform," said the officer. Off he went, returning shortly with a completed form which he handed to me. He directed me to take it down the stairway. Offering profuse thanks and the best salute I could manage, I made my way down the worn wooden stairs, but after a few steps along the pavement, I must have lost consciousness. My next memory is of being carried along, not by Americans, but by 2 French soldiers. Again my belly swelled and I felt terribly ill. After what seemed a long walk, these kind men carried me up stone steps and into an entrance hall. They lowered me into a chair, talked to a blue-clad nurse, then with encouraging pats on the shoulder, stepped back and waited. The nurse drew the cork from a small brown bottle, which she handed to me, and I drank its pleasant-tasting contents. She just waited and watched to see how I reacted to the medicine. Whatever I may have wished to do, nature beat me to it. I began to tremble violently, just couldn't stop shaking. To complete the display of weakness, I began to blubber like a kid. Then, the kind soldiers were carrying me again, upstairs and into a large square hall crowded with French soldiers, some dressed, or partly, some wearing greatcoats over underpants and vests, all wounded. The men placed me on a single iron bedstead with a mattress. My friends covered me with 2 blankets. Sleep followed. The lights were on when next I surfaced. I knew then that I was ill and confused, abdomen distended, and experiencing some difficulty in breathing. Next morning, the Major explained to a group of youth newcomers that he understood some of the problems which might now worry us. We should ask for any help we might require, and it would be freely given meanwhile. We should adapt to the changed life as quickly as possible. Follow doctor's instructions. I heard many complain of feeling hungry. I'm sure they were grateful for the kind treatment they received, but living as they had done in prison camps had reduced them almost to the level of wild animals, and they could not change their behavior overnight. I would notice men prying into tents or sheds, anywhere something edible might be found and filched. They still regarded one another with suspicious eyes too. They did not smile, and generally maintained, even in this pleasant hospital camp, the stale, hopeless atmosphere of the POW. When I started to move about a little myself, I came across a number of these men robbing the hospital bakery. The limit in predatory idiocy, surely. This all seemed like the dog eating his own tail. At this rate, there would be no food for anybody tomorrow. Next morning, all of us were summoned to a meeting in the canteen to hear a statement by the Major. It gave further proof of his tolerance and understanding. A mild reproof about the mass larceny, followed by a surprising instruction to those who still felt hungry after eating the meals provided. They should, said the Major, go to the quartermaster's tent 9 o'clock each morning. A ticket would be issued entitling the bearer to a packet of biscuits from the canteen. How the Major financed the free biscuits issue, I couldn't begin to guess, nor how he came to have such a knowledge of degraded men's psychology. Regular meals and ample rest worked wonders for me. One morning, without hindrance, I walked out through the camp gates and entered a village. Walking along the main street, noticed a woman, probably about the same age as my mother, leaning from an upstairs window. For no particular reason, I continued to look her way as I walked, and when she waved and signalled that I should cross the road and join her, I did so. When I entered the open front door, I was faced by an open stairway made of rough wood and devoid of banisters. At the top, I found myself in a large room, almost without furniture, but the woman from the balcony now sat there at a sewing machine. By signs, she indicated that I should seat myself on a box facing her machine. Having some vague idea that she had asked me into her home out of a kindly intention to perhaps offer me a cup of coffee, I sat and awaited developments. But she said nothing, resumed her machining, and thereafter ignored me. Embarrassment kept me alternately glancing at her and looking away out of the window. Perhaps she was expecting somebody who could speak my language. Perhaps, maybe, I wonder, and such passed through my confused mind. But never a guess at what, perhaps, should have been obvious. With much relief, I heard footsteps climbing the stairs and, turning that way, I beheld a girl dressed in what seemed to be the most popular colour among French ladies at that time, namely, black. I observed that she had bare legs and feet and somewhat dirty, ragged clothes. She stood there, silent, and then I got the shock of all shocks. The machinist indicated that I should go with the beggar girl to a bed in the far corner of the room. Meanwhile she, I assumed, would get on with her work and collect cash when I had been served by the poor girl. What a set-up! What a knocking shop! And what a customer! Without money, without desire, and lacking even the strength to raise a stand. Apart from the fact that I had never had a woman, and this would not have been my choice either of place or person. So I walked out, and thus concluded my unforeseen meeting with a madame and her unwashed mademoiselle. Washing and shaving daily, showering when my turn came, and feeling comfortably warm in my new clothing, all helped to restore lost confidence. In fact, throughout my stay at the Independent Air Force Field Hospital, happiness was my lot, with the generous spirit of the Major matched by the staff's efforts to rehabilitate us. But decisions made somewhere resulted in us returned prisoners being removed to an American hospital. I was not allowed to go into town, but such was the kindly treatment freely given by the American doctors and the lovely nurses that only an ingrate would have wished for more freedom. For the first time in many a day I thought about girls and all that. The bloody war is over, the ruddy war is finished. Thoughts of that kind swirled around my nut constantly as I roamed the hospital grounds, canteen and community hall. Happy days indeed, and most of those kind American guys obviously had similar joyful feelings. Then suddenly, I was joining a hospital train. Off to Boulogne, across the Channel, the white cliffs of Dover, disembarkation, and off through the lovely English countryside into Victoria Station and dear old London town.